Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So it is a pleasure to be here this glorious afternoon from New York City, and this evening to those of you in the UK or places nearby, and whatever time of day it is to the rest of you around the world. I went to Australia for the first time this year and spent 3 weeks in Sydney and Melbourne. So I happen to know that, well, there was a 16-hour time difference when I was there. It's 14 now. So it's 5 a.m. in Sydney. If anybody here from Australia, good morning to you. Okay. I'll mention too that my reason for going to Australia was to give a paper at a Taylor Swift conference. My paper was attempting to tease out connections between Taylor Swift and our friend Trollope. And I'm sure if we were all in a room together now, I'd be seeing your puzzled and probably alarmed faces. Anyhow, it was great fun, and I saw her in concert too, which I do recommend. I always love speaking to the Trollope Society, so I'm very grateful, Dom, that you've asked me today, and grateful that my dear friend Michael Williamson is here, who helped with the publication of the Duke's Children in countless ways, and who contributed several sections to the apparatus of the Oxford edition. Finally, I'm grateful that Bob Wiseman and his wife Karen are here. Bob assisted me in the reconstruction of the book. I saw you, Bob and Karen, in person just a few days ago, which is not hard to do when you live only 20 blocks away, but I am glad you can be here in cyberspace too. I also want to say before I get going properly that I took a walk in Central Park over the weekend, and as is often the case when I'm there, I thought of Trollope. First of all, he has a couple of very entertaining paragraphs about it in his book, North America from the 1860s, including this. But the glory of New York is the Central Park, its glory in the minds of all New Yorkers of the present day. The first question asked of you is whether you have seen the Central Park. And the second is as to what you think of it. It does not do to say simply that it is fine, grand, beautiful, and miraculous. You must swear by cock and pie that it is more fine, more grand, more beautiful, more miraculous than anything else of the kind anywhere. Here you encounter in its most annoying form that necessity for eulogium which presses you everywhere. For in truth, taken as it is at present, the Central Park is not fine, nor grand, nor beautiful. As to the miracle, let that pass. It is perhaps as miraculous as some other great latter-day miracles. Now, Trollope does go on to say that he expects the park to get better, and I do wonder what he would think of it now. Regardless, as a native New Yorker who has always loved Central Park, I get a kick out of thinking that I am just as tiresome praising it now as people were over a century and a half ago. But also, it is in Central Park that I was sometimes able to do very particular work regarding the Duke's children. As many of you know, Trollope wrote the book in 1876 and then put it away. In 1878, under duress, he agreed to cut over 20% of the words in the novel so that it could appear in a weekly periodical called All the Year Round, where it ran for 9 months beginning in October 1879. While there were many, many different challenges that we faced in reconstructing the original manuscript so that the book could be published for the first time as close as possible to the way it would have appeared had Trollope not been forced to cut, one basic issue was Trollope's handwriting. Never great to begin with, and at this point in his life, it had deteriorated tremendously. Most of the work that I did on the book needed to be done inside at a desk, but the knotty task of deciphering some of the words buried beneath Trollope's crossouts could sometimes be done in Central Park. There were words that remained mysteries literally, and I mean literally, for years. And something about the park, the light, trees, the smell in the air, the sights and sounds of the people passing by, something about the park helped me to solve a number of those entrenched mysteries. So I've always believed that Trollope would be quite pleased to see his complete Duke's Children in print. And I love that Central Park, miraculous, after all, played a small part. Okay, so in introducing the novel, I want to focus on three key elements. Its position as the last in the Palliser series compared to the last Chronicle of Barset as the last of the Barsetshire series. Its position as a sequel in particular to the Prime Minister, the previous book in the Palliser series, and its position as the next book that Trollope wrote after his autobiography. So he began writing The Last Chronicle in 1866, Prime Minister he began in 1874, and he wrote his autobiography from late 1875 to April of 1876. So after just a few comments on all of that, I will talk more directly about some of the cuts in the first 10 chapters. If you recall, The Last Chronicle has a grand elegiac ending. There is nothing of the sort in The Duke's Children. I won't spoil the ending, though spoiling is a strange concept in regard to Trollope, given how comparatively little he cared about plot. I do think the whole last chapter is outstanding, especially with the restored final paragraphs, but it contains no farewell to the series or to the characters. And it's not just the ending. There's nothing about the novel that indicates Trollope is nostalgic about letting go of the series. By contrast, think about the decline and death of Mr. Harding in The Last Chronicle, and how much of our emotional response is tied to how well we've known and loved him since he was the main character of The Warden, the first Chronicle of Barset. Indeed, had Trollope been as sentimental about the Duke's Children as The Last Chronicle, I do not believe he would have been able to cut the manuscript the way he did. When he did cut the book, 2 years after he wrote it, he was able to return to it from a distance, enabling him to proceed rather ruthlessly. Did Trollope even believe that The Duke's Children was the last chronicle of Palliser? Yes, I think so. Did Trollope intend The Duke's Children to be the finale? Here we get into the fine points of language, but intend may be too strong a word. Trollope had no plans that we know of to write another Palliser book. However, though he was only in his early 60s when he first wrote the manuscript in 1876, he had some health issues and was already starting to think of himself as an old man. He did not seem to consider himself a likely candidate for a productive and very old age. Trollope was 67 when he died. I happen to think that if he had survived another decade or so and was able to write as normal, he might well have produced another novel with a number of the same characters from the Palliser series. But I am just speculating. It's also important to note the difference in Trollope's status when he wrote The Last Chronicle of Barset as compared to The Duke's Children. Trollope most likely was forcing himself to end the Barsetshire series out of a fear that it would destroy him artistically by encouraging him to become stale and repetitive. So he had to make an actual promise in his title and in the last sentence of the book, which ends, with some solemnity of assurance, the promise made in my title, that this shall be the last chronicle of Barset. It would have been presumptuous for him to make a similar promise at the end of The Duke's Children, when there weren't as many readers around who cared. Also, by the time he did come to the ending of The Duke's Children, The Prime Minister had been published and commercially was a rotten failure. What is most important about The Last Chronicle and how it influenced The Duke's Children is not the end of the series, but rather the treatment of one character in particular, Mrs. Proudie. Taking someone so vibrant who had appeared through a number of books and having her die suddenly. Trollope was exceptionally pleased with himself for disposing of Mrs. Proudie. We can see that in the autobiography and his high-spirited account of telling two clergymen who were tired of her that he would kill her off. And by the way, I'd just like to put in a little plug for an article I wrote about this in Trollopiana many years ago called Killing Mrs. Proudie, which argues that this passage from the autobiography has always been misread and is in fact an example of Trollope at his most playful and, importantly, his most subtle. Anyhow, Mrs. Proudie's death, effective as it is, doesn't change The Last Chronicle all that much. Her role in it is largely complete when she dies, and we don't learn anything especially new about any of the characters because of her demise. Whereas The Duke's Children would have been an entirely different novel from page one, literally from sentence one, if Glencora were alive and well. In his autobiography, Trollope talks about creating characters who are, quote, speaking, moving, living, human creatures, end quote. And how Glencora, Plantagenet, along with Reverend Crawley from the Last Chronicle, are the three characters who would be best known if Trollope's work were to survive into the next century. To begin a new novel with the sudden death of one of those characters took a good bit of gumption on Trollope's part, and may well not have been possible had he not already tested the waters successfully with Mrs. Proudie. In the Last Chronicle, we get a tiny glimpse into the bishop's state of mind after Mrs. Proudie dies, but there isn't necessarily that much to say. We can figure out how bereft and how paralyzed he feels, especially given how much she has controlled his life. Plus, we can imagine the guilt as she dies when they're not speaking, when he's told her he'd be better off without her. In The Duke's Children, on the other hand, the Duke is faced with several crises immediately. The Mary Frank engagement, as well as what he sees as the political betrayal of his elder son. He's not just a man in mourning. These crises require many decisions on what to say and what to do. And given how little parenting he has ever done and how little he knows his own children, he is utterly at sea. The Duke is a familiar character, but in an entirely new situation, which will reveal aspects of his personality that previously were less salient. Trollope was always looking to challenge himself, which in large part is how he managed to keep himself fresh, remaining prolific in his final years and writing just as well as he ever had. While he no doubt would have enjoyed writing more about a living, breathing Duchess, her sudden death provided him with fascinating possibilities. Here I'd like to bring in a well-known passage from his autobiography when Trollope talks about novelists needing to live with their characters and their imagination in order to make those characters live on the page. And I'll share the screen on that one. Okay, well, that's good enough. They must be with him as he lies down to sleep and as he wakes from his dreams. He must learn to hate them and to love them. He must argue with them, quarrel with them, forgive them, and even submit to them. He must know of them whether they be cold-blooded or passionate, whether true or false, and how far true and how far false. The depth and the breadth and the narrowness and the shallowness of each should be clear to him. And as here in our outer world, we know that men and women change, become worse or better as temptation or conscience may guide them. So should these creations of his change, and every change should be noted by him. On the last day of each month recorded, every person in his novel should be a month older than on the first. If the would-be novelist have aptitudes that way, all this will come to him without much struggling. But if it do not come, I think he can only make novels of wood. If we follow the Duke from the final months depicted in The Prime Minister through what we learn about the 2 years that pass while the story of the Duke's Children begins, then through to the end of the Duke's Children, we can see how Trollope fulfills these ambitions without, I contend, a single misstep. This despite the fact that the Duke's behavior is somewhat surprising and even shocking. In the early chapters, look at the way he speaks when Frank Tregear pays a call to ask for Mary's hand in marriage. The Duke's response might remind us, a bit uncomfortably, of Abel Wharton, a very different kind of man and father, in The Prime Minister when Ferdinand Lopez pays a similar call. Or look at some of the cutting ways he deals with his elder son, Lord Silverbridge. Or, most noticeably, look at the Duke's brutal treatment of Mrs. Finn, when against all evidence, he blames her for the Mary-Frank entanglement. In these early chapters, the Duke is at a low point in his life, which is not solely the result of his wife's death. By the end of The Prime Minister, he is deeply unhappy. He sees himself as a failure as prime minister, yet he also does not wish to relinquish power. While his colleagues urge him to take on an important role in the new government, he refuses peevishly. He remains devoted to his wife, but he knows that she considers him a failure as well. His skin has gotten even thinner, and his isolation from other human beings more pronounced. He is, however, as fair-minded and principled as ever, a gentleman through and through. The beginning of The Duke's Children, we learn that 2 years have passed since the end of the previous book, much of which the family has spent abroad. A key sentence, restored to the complete edition, tells us that both the Duke and Duchess, quote, sighed to return to active life in London, quote, without any free communication of their thoughts, one to another. Even when they both want the same thing, they are still unable to talk about it. Their marriage is intact, but not necessarily healthy. And then the Duchess dies, whereupon the Duke feels, quote, dissevered from the world, filled with regret and self-pity. Yet he is unable to hide and is desperate to do right by his children. Alas, he can never make up for all the time he spent with his blue books and ignoring his wife. Nor can he easily make up for the lost time with his own children. Consider how in The Prime Minister, the Duke somewhat passionately for him at least, explains his political creed. But he explains it to Phineas Finn, not to Lord Silverbridge. Had he ever even thought of doing so with the latter, he would not be faced with the pain of seeing his son join the political opposition. It is not, I trust, spoiling anything when I say that by the end of The Duke's Children, the Duke and Lord Silverbridge come to know each other considerably better. Nor is it spoiling anything to say that while Silverbridge starts the novel as little more than a boy, despite being 22 years old, he ends the novel as a man. What kind of man, for good or ill, you will discover and perhaps debate. These are both major strands in The Duke's Children, developed with hundreds of details, a number of which were cut out of the originally published version. That Trollope would be especially eager to explore those strands in fiction seems logical enough, considering that he began writing The Duke's Children just weeks after finishing the autobiography. Whatever misgivings or frustrations he had about his two grown sons at the time, Henry was born in 1846, Fred in 1847, or about his own role as a father in a obviously crazily busy life, he was not willing to divulge. But with a fictional character, he could explore how one father might feel about his children's failings and his own parental failings. In the same vein, though Trollope is more than willing to tell us how unpromising he himself was as a young man, he is light on details about how he was able not only to grow up, but to transform himself. With another fictional character, Lord Silverbridge, Trollope could paint a complete picture about how such maturation might occur month by month. The Duke's Children, then, while not autobiographical, is still, I believe, fueled by Trollope's very fresh experiences writing that autobiography. Let me now say a few things about the restored cuts, and of course I can say more in the Q&A if you wish. As painful as it was for Trollope to chop so much out of the novel, he most likely was able to see something positive in the endeavor. The challenge of cutting words, sentences, paragraphs without destroying the novel. And here again, I want to refer to how Trollope was still prolific, still writing just as well, I think, in his last 5 or 6 years as any other time in his career, and just how extraordinary that is when you think about it. Perhaps the word miraculous is suitable again. So I do think that cutting The Duke's Children was at least somewhat healthy for Trollope, just in the narrow sense that it was something new, a major, major challenge for him to do, that he was looking for challenges and to keep himself fresh. With that said, so much is lost. Much is lost. In the first 10 chapters, I will give a few examples. And let's see here. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to share the screen again so you can see some of these. Okay. All right. So all the page numbers refer to the Oxford edition. So this is the one that I mentioned a few minutes ago, just in the first couple of pages. This, so what's in boldface is what he cut, and is now restored in the complete edition. And so they had both sides be again among the trumpets without any free communication of their thoughts one to the other. I just find this, incredibly revealing and poignant that even after going abroad and after all that has happened, they still both want to go back to London and get involved again, that they can't talk about it with each other. Next, also in chapter 1, so there's this passage about Alice from Can You Forgive Her? So it's a wonderful nod to the beginning of the series. So this whole paragraph was cut out. Should I read it out loud, or is it good enough to show? Read it? Okay. The friend whom he most trusted was a certain Mrs. Gray. She had been a distant cousin of his wife, and with her he had always maintained something like real friendship. He and his wife, who on such matters were often at variance, had agreed in valuing the society of this lady. And in the early days of the Duke's married life, she had been much with them. But any close social intercourse with persons so far above him in rank had hardly suited Mr. Gray's views, and he had somewhat discouraged the near intimacy which the Duchess certainly would have liked. But the poor widower, when he looked about thinking where he might find assistance, turned his mind more frequently to Mrs. Gray than to any other female friend. What I find most interesting about this passage is this part about it wouldn't suit Mr. Gray's views. That Alice was worried about losing her sense of self and what marriage might bring to her. And we only see tiny glimpses of her in the rest of the series, but this is as strong an indication, I think, as there is that maybe things are not as perfect as she would wish. Okay, so also in chapter 1, so the Duke has asked Mrs. Finn to just stay a couple of days longer after Glencore's death. When she left the room, he was almost harsh to her in his manner, saying little or nothing to thank her for her compliance, but showing plainly that he wished to be alone again. This is really interesting because this is before he has any indication or any thought that she has done wrong to him, which we know she has not, but he thinks so. And yet he's still harsh or almost harsh to her in his manner. This part at the end of the paragraph too is interesting. From a word or two that was said by Lady Mary, Mrs. Finn learned that the father and his eldest son had not parted altogether on pleasant terms with each other. The mother and wife has just died, and yet the kids can barely see fit to stay with their father. And when they part, or at least when Lord Silverbridge parts, he's not getting along with the Duke. So, and there are just a number of details in the early chapters that change, somewhat darken the tone, I would say. This one on page 2. Now, this, as you see, this paragraph is mostly intact. This is about Mary. The part that is restored is this last sentence. Those who knew the Duchess well and who would declare that the daughter was the image of the mother would generally add something to signify that both in manner and appearance, the copy excelled the original. Now, I put this one in to be, I don't know, a little playful, maybe. I don't know. I actually not sure I like this this restored sentence, and it certainly could be worth talking about. I think it promises a little more than the book ends up perhaps giving, that there's going to be some real noticeable similarities between Mary and Glencora. And I don't know, I'm not sure. I think that this helps to create some more expectations that maybe are not fulfilled. Again, that's very debatable, I know. But I mean, there was no, in terms of editorially, the sentence had to go back. I mean, it was clearly cut for space reasons, and unless there was something that had been cut that was so egregious that if Trollope had seen it in proofs, he would have said, "Oh my gosh, got to get rid of that." Oh, I had to put it back. So that's that sentence. This sentence, this is the end of chapter 2. Mrs. Finn knows that she needs to talk to the Duke about this marriage, but she's giving Frank a chance to be the first one to speak to the Duke. So the sentence ends, she's asking to see him, but look at what got cut out. And here's an example. It's not that there's any particular crucial information here, but look at so much flavor is lost from passages like this one being cut. And this letter was directed to the Bear Garden Club, that being the only address for her lover, which the young lady knew. Of course he has a residence, she said with some touch of disdain in her voice. When he is at home, he lives at Polwenning, where the Tregears have lived from before the conquest. But a young man isn't always under his mother's apron string. No, I don't know where he sleeps when he is in London. The Tregears have no townhouse. They don't come to town. I suppose they are not rich enough. I don't think they are a bit inferior because of that. Mrs. Finn, certainly not, only I did not know whether you might not have a better address than the Gentleman's Club. I have no address and had no intention of writing to him, but the name of the club is on the note which I got from him immediately after poor Mama's death. So again, I think that's just wonderful, and so many of the chapter endings were cut, including bizarrely the ending of the 80th chapter, the last chapter in the book, which just shows you how almost, I don't want to say mechanically, but just maniacally almost, Trollope just got into his rhythm of cutting, and he was used to cutting flavor at the end of chapters. And even if it was the last chapter of the book, so what? Now, this is a long one, so maybe I won't read the whole thing, but this is Frank Tregear. This is a whole paragraph talking about his inability to find a profession. Well, his inability to work. I mean, I especially love this part about to the bar. To the bar, he made many objections. He did not, he said, like the duplicity. He did not, in truth, like the labor. He liked to be a gentleman at large, having certain vague ideas as to a future career in Parliament. And he tried very much in vain to satisfy himself by thinking that he could be content to live among gentlemen as a poor man. I mean, this is deluding himself. And, Frank is a very complicated character. In the early chapters, you may think that he's going to be like Ferdinand Lopez in The Prime Minister, and he's not. But he's complicated, and given what Trollope thinks about work and the value of work, the fact that he has this character who won't work, does not speak well for Frank. This paragraph here, I think, is important early in the book because it it shows you that the Duke, it's not just that that the Duke, the Pallisers have always been liberal and therefore his son should be, that he has real conviction behind it. Now, if we remember from the prime minister, he explains his conviction. But I think for this book, it's very useful that he is talking. We see into his mind here why he's so upset that his son is not following him. This one is about Frank. I like this sentence. He was one who prided himself on being the master of others in the great affairs of life and on submitting himself to no masterdom. Uh, it does make you wonder that, what is he going to be like later in the book, and then even after the book? What, if he and Mary do go on to get married, what would that be like? Will Mary want to be with somebody who submits to no masterdom? I am interesting. This passage here is just Frank wants to get into the Duke's good graces, so he doesn't mind if Silverbridge switches over to the Liberals. But I just, this additional part is, I think, quite something. He thought that if it could be done by Silverbridge obeying his behests in this matter of politics, the sacrifice made would not be very great. They're best friends, so this shows a scornfulness, I think, toward Silverbridge. Very quickly, Mrs. Finn at the end of chapter 4, and she says, "Silly boy, even if he had money, he would not be fit to marry her." Mrs. Finn is always right, or usually almost always right. So this, is interesting that this is what she thinks. I do also want to point out here, Tregear wrote a most chilly note to Mrs. Finn. All the editions of the Duke's Children until our edition, it was chilling, which doesn't make sense. There were close to 200 just misprints by the compositor that they just misread what Trollope wrote in the manuscript that we were able to correct. And clearly chilly is and it's what he wrote also, and it's clearly the right word. She's not writing a chilling note. This one I'll just pass quickly, but it's Major Tifto, and it's just details. The minor characters in the book, there's so many more details about them. Okay, you cut them out, fine, but you start adding them up and it just takes away from the depth and richness of the entire novel. So here's some kind of good stuff about Major Tifto. And just the last couple, this one is the Duke and his Silverbridge, and the Silverbridge is saying, "You've never spoken to me on the subject in your life before about politics." I'm sorry, the Duke is saying that, but Silverbridge responds, "Nor you to me, sir." This was true, or very nearly so, and the Duke felt that the reproach was just. So even in the midst of all of his anger and this tumultuous time in his life, the Duke is always striving to be just. But also, of course, again, just the fact that they never spoke about something so crucial is quite extraordinary. Anyhow, here's the last one I'm going to show. This is the end of chapter 9. And it's Frank and Silverbridge talking about Mabel. So here you see Frank says, "I'm too fond of Mabel to get into an argument with her father. We've known each other so long that she's almost like a sister to me." Well, I mean, he's lying. Maybe that's too strong a word. I mean, they've had a relationship that is not just like a sister. And Silverbridge is, his best friend, but he's obviously never talked about it, even though other people have heard about this relationship. It comes up later in the book. And then also the last thing, I look at her, this is Frank, just as I would at a picture. And in that way, I think she's the most beautiful thing to be seen in London. I don't know, kind of, she's a picture. It doesn't, he's not necessarily thinking of Mabel in her full humanity, perhaps. Again, Frank, a very complex character, a very rich character, and there's just a lot in the book. Okay, I will stop and yes, questions.